Chris O'Leary. I'm not going to lie, I found the naming of Cardinal Prevost as Pope Leo XIV. My initial reaction was that it was very troubling, that it was very disturbing. I thought it was potentially a disaster for the Catholic Church and for survivors. That's based on some reports that I've heard about his handling of abuse in Chiclayo, the story of the three sisters, a story that's very familiar to me, that's basically my story. You know, tales of slow walking, of lip service, of razzle dazzle, the appearance of caring. Underneath it all, an arrogant indifference, a clericalism that really speaks to the root of the Catholic sex abuse crisis. The concern for survivors is that the Catholic Church really seems to be entering or trying to enter a post survivor era. The Catholic Church has moved on, and it believes that survivors need to move on. And I'll ask the question as always, how? When I was a child, I was raped by a priest. That's a big deal. And then things got really bad. How does someone move on from that? I will kind of immediately say that, rumors and reports are very often wrong. Uh, there were rumors that the new Pope Leo, was a Cubs fan, which, for the folks over there, that's the equivalent of being a Man U fan and finding that the Pope is a Man City fan or vice versa. Uh, it's a very difficult joke to make given the stakes, but that's kind of the initial reaction. But I will make the point that, rumors are very often wrong. And more importantly, the Pope can govern very differently than he did as a bishop or as a cardinal. He's giving the orders versus following the orders. So in terms of moving forward, first and foremost, there'll be the question of Pope Francis, who, while beloved, collected abuser art, had abuser art hanging in his apartment. How is Pope Francis' story going to be handled? What's going to be done with the abuser art? In terms of Pope Leo, I've got a number of questions. Again, what's going to happen with the Chiclayo sisters and Chicago? Is it going to be discussable? If the Chiclayo sisters are helped, does that help extend beyond them, or are they just kind of a test case, really just kind of a razzle dazzle? What happens to Father Marco Rupnik, the handling of the case of Father Marco Rupnik? Is that pursued, or is it kind of swept under the rug? Does it just kind of go away? I'm going to be looking very closely because it affects my story, which is Pope Francis' law of Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which does two things. Basically, it gives a Bill of Rights for survivors and a code of conduct for bishops. Is Vos Estis going to be continued? Is it going to be enforced? Or again, is it just going to kind of fade away? What happens to the Papal Commission for the protection of minors? Again, is it continued or does it just fade away? What happens, is there going to be an addition of a Papal Commission for the restoration and assistance of survivors? It's a big question as a survivor. The Catholic Church really is unafraid to discuss the topic of protecting minors, but the Catholic Church doesn't discuss the topic of survivors, of survivor assistance, of a survivor restoration. That's going to be a kind of a big point for me, a big turning point, maybe the turning point. Again, in terms of Chiclayo, that raises questions about the abuse of women and whether the abuse of women is seen or treated differently than the abuse of men. I've had men in St. Louis tell me that while my abuse as a young boy was bad, the sexual abuse of women, is that even a thing? Is that attitude going to continue? What happens to Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who was really my dark horse candidate for Pope? What happens to him? What happens to his status? I think that's going to be a real interesting thing to watch. Same for Father Hans Zollner. And, to close, I'd like to address Pope Leo XIV directly. And I'll give you a Missouri versus Illinois thing. Talk is cheap. Show me. I'd be more than glad to come to Rome, to the Vatican, to have an audience with the new Pope Leo to discuss the reality of life for survivors in St. Louis and around the world. Please take me up on that. Show me.